We're going to move on now to topical questions. And our first and only question today is from Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will clarify the role that education settings would play in any circuit breaker strategy.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, discussions are continuing as to what further steps are required to reduce the spread of COVID-19 in Scotland. These include the possibility of a package of stricter measures in place over a relatively short period of time to reduce prevalence. If we decided to implement any such package, keeping education settings open would continue to be a priority. We will look carefully at current arrangements, but given the low levels of transmission in such settings, I would not expect the measures to impact significantly on the guidance in place for children, young people, learners and staff in our schools, childcare services, colleges and universities.
Jamie Green.
Thank you. If I read that response correctly, I think it is to be welcomed, because the reality is that thousands of children have undergone significant disruption to their education already this year. And I think parents watching this will be looking for comfort and I think direct reassurance that schools will not experience any additional closures out with those which are either already planned school holidays or closures which are reacting to localised virus outbreaks and management and control. Can the Cabinet Secretary in his further response offer that direct reassurance? And can he also confirm that if any current proposals around school closures will also apply to all education settings, including nurseries, colleges and universities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the Government has worked very hard with our partners to secure the reopening of education services for in the early learning sector, in schools, in our colleges and our universities, because we recognise the enormous benefit that being in full-time education brings to children and young people within Scotland. So it is an absolute priority for the Government to ensure that our education settings remain open. We will obviously have to follow public health advice in relation to any particular localised virus outbreaks, but I hope from what I'm saying to Parliament today, members of the public will take reassurance that the Government is absolutely focused and committed to ensuring that we maintain our education settings as open on a full-time basis, and our planning and our actions will be designed to support that objective.
Jamie Green.
Again, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that further reassurance. I'm slightly reading between the lines. I'm looking for perhaps a more direct commitment that there will not be school closures out with of either planned school holidays or localised outbreak management if there is any further national restrictions. It goes without saying that any circuit breaker strategy or proposal will cause significant disruption to people's lives, particularly those with children. And I think the Deputy First Minister will also be aware of the need to command the confidence of this Parliament and the wider public in any such restrictive national measures. So can some further confirmation be given that when coming to any conclusions on new measures, that the impact on parents' ability to work, if childcare or education is disrupted, will be taken into account in that decision-making and indeed mitigated against, that disruption to education will be kept to an absolute minimum in any nationwide restrictions, and finally, will he commit to publishing the scientific evidence or data that is driving these decisions so that elected members of this place are able to properly scrutinise, debate and ultimately vote on any further nationwide restrictions before they are introduced?
Cabinet Secretary.
There's a lot in that question, Presiding Officer, and quite a lot of it I've answered already by giving the clarity that the Government attaches the absolute priority to the reopening, to maintaining the school and education environment as being open on a full-time basis. I would remind Parliament that Scotland was the first part of the United Kingdom to restore full-time education to all pupils, and I want to keep it that way. Now, Mr Green asks about the parliamentary processes that are undertaken. Mr Russell is undertaking discussions on the First Minister's behalf on that question in relation to parliamentary dialogue, and indeed I understand the Parliamentary Bureau discussed this issue in the scheduling of business for this week, so Parliament will have the opportunity to discuss these questions. And of course the First Minister will make a statement to Parliament tomorrow on the next stage that we have to confront. Now, Mr Green asks about the publication of information, as if somehow the information about the pandemic is a secret. There is a huge amount of information that's published on a daily basis about the level of cases. There are 800 new positive cases today. 800. That is a very significant increase on where we were a few weeks ago, and the number of positive cases have been of that order for some considerable time. So I don't think it's in any way a secret that the pandemic is accelerating within Scotland. We have taken action already to try to stem that rise. There may be a necessity for us to take further actions, and of course Parliament will hear from the First Minister tomorrow and will be able to discuss and to consider any issues that flow from those announcements tomorrow.
Claire Adamson, to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has been clear in its commitment to strike the right balance of measures, most importantly to control the spread of the virus and save lives, but also to ensure that our schools are able to remain open, which will allow, we know is both vital for the development and the well-being of our pupils. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister what engagement the Education Recovery Group has had with teaching unions, parents and carers ahead of the October break to ensure that staff and pupils have confidence in these measures?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the Education Recovery Group has continued to meet on a weekly basis since the resumption of full-time schooling in August, and indeed had met on a very regular basis over the period of lockdown into the bargain. We issued guidance prior to the reopening of the school system. We have updated that guidance on further occasions. We have changed that guidance by strengthening it in relation to the wearing of face coverings in the secondary school sector, and we keep the guidance under active review on a weekly basis. We look at the feedback from the professional associations, from the Association of Directors of Education, from our local authority partners, to make sure that we are taking all of the necessary decisions to address the situation. And I give Claire Adamson the reassurance, because I know that she takes a very close interest in issues around safety. It's a long-term parliamentary interest of Claire Adamson's, that the issues of safety are uppermost in our thinking in the consideration of that guidance, and if there are further measures that we need to take to make our school estate safe, we will be prepared to take those actions.
And Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that many vocational courses offered by the college sector include components which can't be delivered through remote learning, and many of these courses are already considerably impacted by previous and existing coronavirus restrictions. So can the Cabinet Secretary advise me what further impact any circuit breaker restrictions would have on the delivery of these courses, and what discussions he has had with the college sector to help mitigate any impact?
Cabinet Secretary.
Obviously, it's our determined effort to minimise any impact on learning and teaching. And indeed, the maximisation of learning and teaching opportunities is a very significant priority for me, and it weighs heavily on some of the decision-making I'm taking on other questions. So the ministers are regularly involved in dialogue with the college sector to ensure that we are taking all steps possible to ensure that the educational opportunities of students are able to be fulfilled. The college sector, like universities and schools, have adapted significantly in the way in which they deploy their courses to meet these challenges, and we will continue to support that work. Of course, we have taken a number of practical steps through the distribution of resources for digital access to make sure that that individual circumstances are not a barrier to access to those resources and those capabilities, and we will continue to keep all measures under review to ensure that that remains the case.
Thank you very much. That concludes topical questions, and we'll move on to the next item of business just after a short pause.